Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Tonight, we're going to be talking about housing. My guest is Aled Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist for the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I've had the privilege of interviewing him previously when we were talking about primarily supply issues and how the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation was thinking that we needed, I think it was 1.8 million additional homes, incremental to what was going to be built already in I can't remember whether Southern Ontario or Ontario or the GTA.
Ontario.
But I found that interesting. And then Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, sort of adopted some of that by saying we need 1.5 million homes, but it wasn't incremental. It was just total. So he's lost out the whole incremental piece. Anyway, that was kind of an interesting. The number got taken, but not the denominator, I guess, which was kind of interesting, or the multiplier. Anyway, sir, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you.
So, what do you think of some of the things that are going on right now and how they're going to impact housing? You've got a couple of countervailing issues going on. One is that the Bank of Canada have increased interest rates fairly dramatically, which has lessened people's interest in buying homes and has potentially brought housing prices down. But it's also dampened, people's ability and desire to build. It's made construction financing more expensive. The lack of demand or people's concerned about pricing has put potentially condos on hold. And then you got Bill 23 that is trying to incentivize, if not demand, municipalities to increase supply. And it's become, and I think you've got to take credit for some of this, it's almost become issue number one in public policy these days, the housing crisis. So where do you come out with what's going on right now? Is this good for housing and our problem, or bad?
There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot going on. And even unpacking all the points that you made in your opening comments is going to take a while. That's
why we invited in an expert, sir.
There's a few bad things going on, but I'm hopeful that all this policy change on the supply is going to generate long-term change. So we can start on the short-term sides. The Bank of Canada has been raising interest rates. Clearly, they had to. They were probably late, but they had to curtail inflation, and inflation has a tendency of wrecking a lot of things. So clearly, the Bank of Canada had to do this. Now, a lot of that is going to work through the housing system. Obviously, we've seen mortgage rates go up a lot, and this has been quite a negative on house prices. It's made affordability in the ownership sector considerably more difficult, and so that straight out affordability for the first-time home buyers is now an increasing challenge. So that's one aspect. House prices have come down. Arguably, they were a bit inflated after COVID. Well, arguably, they were almost certainly inflated after COVID. There's been some unpacking of the limits on the froth from the COVID, but there's been a bit of piling on with higher mortgage rates, and clearly that's put a damper on house prices. Now, one aspect to pivot a little bit from or make your opening remarks even more complicated is the impact on the rental system. Obviously, people are now it's a greater challenge to get into home ownership, so people are staying in rental. There's a lot of other people that may want to come to Toronto or the GTA. They want to get into rental. The immigration is starting up again. It's quite a few of them, not all of them. Some of them want home ownership, but some of them will go into rental. So there's a lot of demand for rental, and there's basically way not enough rental being built, particularly in Southern Ontario or the GTA. And that's creating quite a lot of stress in the rental system. So the rental system is facing challenges. Rents are going up. There's sort of a step change in rents. House prices are coming down, but there are affordability challenges now in home ownership because getting that first home is challenging. So on top of that, you mentioned you put it in there as the impact of higher interest rates on financing. We're not completely sure how this is going to pan out. Our initial thought was that, and you hear it quite a bit in the press, that quite a few condos were going to be delayed. But I mean, particularly basically the large structures, so things that you really needed a lot of financing for. We were thinking those that would be hit quite hard with the higher interest rates. Some of that may not be as acute because, and what we're seeing is that this, and I mentioned it a bit, is these very high rents that you get on new units. So even with higher financing costs, it may be that constructing or building rental buildings may still be profitable because of the high rents available. And of course, we need that supply in the rental sector.
But
So
the rental buildings typically don't have the same debt to construction cost that you can raise.
yeah.
It's a longer time period to get your money out because you got to rent it up to get to stabilization before you can do a financing versus just sell those condos.
Yeah.
So it's a more challenging business
Yeah.
to make money at, is it not?
It's a different business. I've talked, and you probably know more about some of these developers than I do, but you know, it building for condos, building for rental, it is a bit of a different business. The rental, particularly if you're going to hold on to the units, it's you're trying to build something that will keep those tenants for the long term. There are different costs involved in the equipment to make sure they're extremely durable. So it's a different business model. I agree. It's so and when you but we are still facing a shortage of these rental structures.
So rental prices are up, rental rates are up. Affordability is worsened because interest rates are up, even if prices have come down somewhat. So have we made things worse or better?
Um, well, like I said, I think higher interest rates were unavoidable. Now, as I said, maybe the bank could have gone earlier and maybe it wouldn't have had to have been quite so aggressive. So I think affordability is worse at the moment, but our mantra remains we need more supply, rental, ownership, everything. So I don't think we can say that we have made things better, made things worse. Things are not good at the moment, but with more supply, we can hope.
We
Yeah, and
can
that's
hope
where
with more
government
supply. So it all comes
policy.
down to this Bill 23
Yeah.
and getting rid of NIMBYism. I got to ask you about an article before I go on to that you actually commented on, which is in the Financial Post last week about why there's no quick fix to Canada's housing supply woes, which was suggesting that it's a long-term problem. But we're going to take a break and give you a couple of minutes to think about the answer to that question before we come back and chat further on Canada's housing crisis and what the solutions are. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about housing and the housing crisis, affordability, supply, interest rates, rental rates, etc., with the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Aled Iorwerth, who, as I mentioned, is the Deputy Chief Economist. He's got an unbelievable, impressive background, which I won't go through right now. I might talk about later, but you've got all the credentials to make you an expert. And so I really appreciate you coming on the show. I got to ask you, though, because you actually commented last week about a nice article summarizing the challenges we face, about an article in the Financial Post that says, much worse before it gets better. Why there's no quick fix to Canada's housing supply. Why is it going to get even worse?
Well, partly it relates to what we were discussing earlier, that supply this year is likely to be challenged. So in the short term, because of financing, supply is going to be stretched. are difficult. We have ongoing inflation and construction cost challenges, which are starting to diminish. But we're also getting a lot of demand increases. So the economy is recovering after COVID, income's growing, immigration is growing, and just turning on the tap on housing supply is going to take a lot of time. Unfortunately, that's one thing that we're really trying to hope to accelerate or encourage or change, but just the whole process is taking too long. And I mean, normally we talk a lot about government's role in that, but we're hoping that there'll be more innovation on the construction side as well. I'm not an engineer, and I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about, but the rate of productivity growth in construction has not been very strong over years, decades. But there must be some opportunity for improved productivity, more rapid construction for housing, and we are seeing digital economy everywhere. I'm not sure that we're seeing much of it in construction now. Like I said, I'm not an engineer. I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about, but there must be some scope for making construction faster, maybe using more mass timber, maybe prefabrication. I was at a conference last year in Quebec City, and they were certainly exploring how the wood industry can contribute to faster building in Canada and around the world.
Well, mass timber has been a topic that a lot of people have talked about. I think one of the restrictions is regulatory restrictions on how high you can go with mass timber. And even though some of the mass timber suppliers would argue that they're not a fire issue, I think a lot of the regulatory requirements assume that they still are a regulatory requirement. And there's numerous different municipalities that won't allow you go higher than what the ladder can get to on a fire engine, which is kind of interesting. You talk about modular housing. People have talked about modular housing since Habitat 67, Expo 67 with Habitat, didn't they? And there seems to have been almost no progress with modular housing. How come?
I have no idea. But we just need to encourage all of this. Now, maybe the modular housing is not, or some of these manufactured homes are not suitable for the GTA, but there are large chunks of Ontario where this sort of housing may be ideal. So we have affordability challenges all over the place, and so anything that can address these issues needs to be explored. And that involves government regulations. As you say, I think there are insurance restrictions with some of this timber stuff. And I think we need to have a bit of a wholesale look at all of these regulations.
Commenting on the Financial Post article we mentioned just a minute ago was an executive director of the Victoria Residential Builders Association, who said that we need to double the number of starts, the housing starts, to reach. In this 1.5 million number that Premier Ford's been talking about, he's given Mississauga as just one example, a challenge of 120,000 homes, which is 12,000 in 10 years, which is 12,000 homes a year. Mississauga averages only 2,000 homes a year. So that's not a doubling. That's a six-fold increase in supply that Doug Ford is mandating. And he's using 1.5 million homes in total rather than the 1.8 million incremental that you talked about. So we got to do a lot more than doubling, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of where this stuff has to happen, but we need a massive increase. Like there's just to ungum the whole system. And people are building in expectations at the moment of house prices going up and up, and I think we just need to dissuade them of this approach. And so I'm hoping that a lot of these policy reforms will just discourage people from betting the farm on future price growth.
But don't you need some of those investors to want to invest to actually get the condos built and the condos sold so that you can get the construction financing?
Right. And this brings up a whole set of issues that we need investors, we need the private sector to get involved. So I've already mentioned a few times the rental sector. The rental sector, I mean, more completely depends on some sort of investor holding that property as an asset and then renting out the units. So we desperately need more of these investors to come in and commit resources to in the rental sector. We also need more investors to help with financing of construction. So clearly, we need an atmosphere, an ecosystem, an environment that really welcomes the private sector investments to come in. It's and so when we have some rhetoric that says, well, these investors are dangerous, or it's discouraging. So we need a lot more, and it's not just to build new housing. The existing stock, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, of rental buildings is getting extremely old. So some of that needs to be retrofitted, redeveloped. All of this requires a large amounts of money, and that has to come from the private sector, and they need to get a reasonable, not excessive, but a reasonable rate of return. So um, there has to be some way of getting investments and investors together, whether it's pension funds, REITs, mom and pop, just everybody involved in the rental sector.
So we interviewed one entrepreneur who said that rent controls for older buildings precluded any kind of profit incentive in buying up older buildings to try to retrofit them.
I agree, and retrofitting is becoming ever more important because we're increasingly concerned about climate change. There's a lot of energy inefficiency in these older buildings, and so they need to be re-engineered in some way now. There are other approaches where you could demolish older buildings, but get the tenants to move out temporarily, and then get the tenants to move back in once the structure has been modernized, enlarged, developed, densified, but keep the original tenants, or keep a place for the original tenants, but densify at the same time. So there's a lot of scope here for innovation, for change. But all of this needs to be encouraged. And so when you have policies that might discourage that investment, it's a long-term problem because the scale is massive.
So are rent controls a bad idea? This entrepreneur was telling me that market rents versus rent controlled rents can be 2 to 3 times higher than rent controlled rents. And he says, if all you're going to get is those rent controlled rents, why would you spend a cent?
Well, exactly, and that's where we at CMHC released a report last week on the rental market, and that's where some of the statistics. I mean, you can go on ad nauseum on statistics, but some of those statistics highlighted what you just said. So when units turn over, so that what I mean by that is when somebody leaves a unit and a new tenant comes in Toronto, and that is not rent controlled. In Toronto, you're seeing close to a 30% increase in rents when that happens, as opposed to the normal, I don't know, 2-3% that's allowed in the rent control. So what that jump in turnover rents is saying is that there is a massive demand in the market, and this is a signal that more supply is needed. So with rent control, that signal can be dampened, and so investors can be discouraged from investing in rental. Now, rent control, I mean, it's probably some form of rent control does prevent exploitation, but there has to be some flexibility in it to cover new investment, renovation at a reasonable rate. So those seem to be more prevalent in the province of Quebec. But there seems to be very strict rules, particularly in Ontario. Now, having said that, there were exceptions because the rent control was removed on some of the newer buildings.
But they're not the ones that need retrofits.
Yeah,
the older ones
exactly.
that need to retrofit.
Yeah,
and
yes.
It's difficult to do it one off if you only have a couple of tenants move. You got to do a whole floor, or,
yes, yeah,
a whole building.
Yes, and increasingly, I think it's a whole building. Like some of these buildings, that were built, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago, they may be coming past or they're probably becoming past their useful life. There's no remedy possible. You have to destroy the thing and start from scratch.
Let's come back, if we could, to this, example of Mississauga. There's probably lots of other examples about taking average housing starts from 2,000 a year to 12,000 a year. And I met with a person just last week who said it's actually compounded because it's going to take a couple of years to get up to that whatever that rate is. And so that 12,000 would be what it would be if it started today. It's probably going to be 14, 15, 16,000 a year, because we're not going to be able to get up to that rate for a couple of years. What do municipalities need to do to have a six-fold increase in housing starts?
Well, to get to that sort of increase, basically what you're saying is that a lot of I don't know how much green space you have available in Mississauga, but what I'm guessing, well, what I think would be needed is that you would get some of your single detached housing rezoned to be high-rise structures. Now, it's very easy to say that, but the problem is getting that done in practice, where this sort of rezoning is the one that takes a lot of time. And there's a lot of NIMBYism and opposition to that. There's shadows involved in the rest of it. So, but to sextuple your housing starts, you need a lot more density. So rather than having one single detached house, you have a 300, 500 unit structure. So basically you need a lot of density in Mississauga. And of course that the skills required to build that high rise are quite different from a single detached. So there are skills issues there. You need the capital to finance that. Plus you need to get it built quickly.
Now, you talked about ungumming the system a couple of minutes ago. You came out with a report back last spring that talked about supply issues in municipalities and some of their regulatory processes as being an impediment to getting housing built, and restrictions on supply. Bill 23, which the provincial government has recently put in place, is an attempt at trying to solve that problem. Are you satisfied with it? Some of the things are not allowing so many people to oppose developments in front of the OMB, the OLT, the Ontario Land Tribunal, which I think it's now called, making it shortening the time period in which a municipality has to respond. And if they don't respond within the time period, they have to repay fees, lowering development fees, things like that. What do you think of some of those parts of this bill that the Ontario government's brought forward? Are they helpful?
I think so. I mean, I not every element or every detail I can agree with it, but as far as a comprehensive package as an effort to move in the right direction, I think it's correct. There are issues that people could complain about, or issues, but and maybe there'll be trade-offs or changes as we go forward. And I don't want to say that I endorse every part of it. But I think the overall drift of it is in the right direction. I think it's, getting greater certainty, greater speed. I think all of that is to be welcomed. I think it's opening a debate about how some of these things are funded. I think last time I was with you, you asked me if I had a magic wand, what I would do. I think my response was something along the lines of I would take a close look at municipal financing and get sort of Ontario finance involved, as well as the Municipal Affairs Ministry. So, and I think that's what this bill is starting to do. There are questions being opened about how things are being financed. Are development fees the appropriate instrument, or is the appropriate instrument to tackle some of those expenditures? And so, I'm not sure we all know the answer at the moment, but it's opening the debate around a lot of these things. I still draw attention to the model in Quebec, where a lot of infrastructure is financed by the province rather than the municipalities, and so they're limited to no development fees in Montreal. And I think this must have a part to play in the Montreal, Quebec housing system being a little bit faster to respond to house prices than in Ontario and BC.
So I think development fees in Toronto, Mississauga, some of the suburbs around Toronto, some people have estimated about $140,000 per unit. And so, increases the price of whatever you're bringing to the market by a substantial amount. And the provincial government in their the restriction of development fees are effectively saying development fees are an impediment to building new supply and making supply unaffordable. And some of the mayors around Mississauga and elsewhere have been saying, no, if you reduce the development fees, all that you're going to do is line developers' pockets, that they're not going to pass on any of the saving to consumers, and it's just going to lead to increased development profits. What do you think? What do you think about the impact of a reduction in development fees? Is that a net positive to affordability and supply, or is it just a gift to developers?
It's a net positive to buyers. The academic economists around the world have been hacking at this issue for years, if not decades. And I think the answer is uniformly that development fees get passed forward in some form or other to buyers of new property. And there are arguments why they can even more than passed on, like the 110% of the development fee is passed on because of the strange things happening in the housing market. So I think the academic evidence is fairly clear that development fees are borne in reality by purchasers of housing. Now, I mean, there's some wonky stuff here about who actually pays the development fees. So it's the developers, but the actual incidents, the people who bear the burden of the fees are the people buying the home. So I think the academic literature is fairly unambiguous on this point.
I think it's also intuitively obvious that if you put $140,000 of extra fee tax on a developer, they're going to pass that on to the consumer. They're not going to eat that.
Yeah, exactly.
And if there's big demand and all of a sudden development fees are reduced, basic marginal economics would suggest that people are going to reduce the price and build more supply because more people can afford it at $140,000 less.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think the economics on this point are clear. Yeah.
It's amazing to me that so many politicians still argue against it, though. I guess for their benefit, and maybe because they're trying to argue, as you say, that they're going to lose the money, and maybe the province should come in and fill that gap.
I think the other strand of the argument, and this goes back to my point about the need to look at who pays for what, is that development fees are used to cover quite a bit of infrastructure, but it's not clear that first-time home or the people buying the home should be paying for that infrastructure. Like I said, the model in Quebec is a little bit different, where traditionally Quebec has had this idea that they need to grow the population and therefore there needs to be more housing, and therefore the province covers those infrastructure costs of new housing through general taxation. So that's a little bit the model in Quebec, whereas the model in Ontario is that the people buying their home have to pay the full burden of the of infrastructure, which given the current circumstances, I think may be short-sighted.
I think it's just ethically wrong, frankly. I think that, society, we've decided that things that are of a general good, whether they be swimming pools or police stations or parks or whatever, should be borne by entire society. And what development fees do is effectively they put that tax on the new home buyer, which typically is going to be a new immigrant or a younger person, someone just getting into the marketplace, or a renter. And I think that's just ethically wrong. I think that, and I think some of these progressive politicians that are arguing for development fees are actually arguing against their progressiveness and what they typically stand for. And I worry about why. And I think one of the challenges we've got in our society is that too few people turnout in municipal elections is so low. And the people that typically vote are homeowners, and typically long-term older homeowners, people that look like me rather than people that look like my sons and daughters. And so therefore the new homeowner, the new renter, the younger person, the immigrant aren't the voters that are represented at the ballot box. And so therefore I worry that too many politicians don't vote in the interest of those new people. They only vote in the interests of the older people. And I really think that that's ethically wrong.
I agree with your point, and increasingly I think economically wrong as well. So the economics and the ethics seem to be going in the same direction in this area. And that's why you have some of these YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, communities in the US. They're trying to lobby in favor of immigrants, in favor of people who are moving in, not even just immigrants, people moving from the rest of the US into San Francisco, and pointing out the unfairness of these restrictions in that case on rents or rent controls in San Francisco. There's just there are all of these sort of communities arguing against more supply of housing.
Yeah, Maclean's magazine had an interesting year-end story in their year-end edition about immigration and the rationale for it, and talked about how there's going to be there has been in the past 4 to 5 working people for every one person that's a senior being supported in old age pensions and healthcare and stuff like that. And in the future, it's going to be 2 working people to 1 because of so many baby boomers and other people that are getting past the age of earning a pension and also living a lot longer. And that without immigration, our pension system, our healthcare system is unsustainable. And so we need immigration. Do you agree with that?
Well, there are quite a few nuances there. I'm not a specialist in immigration. I think the overall point that you're making is correct. Certainly, without immigration, Canada's population would be declining, and that would make the pension funds more difficult. I think there's a question of how we get immigrants to contribute most to the economy. I think there was an article by David Green of University of British Columbia on the Globe and Mail a month or 2 ago, and where he went through all the intricacies of the impact of immigrants. So we need to ensure, for example, that the skills of Canadians need to go up as well. And if you have too much immigration, there may be dampened incentives for people to improve their skills. But I think the overall direction is that more immigrants is a good thing. I mean, my point was based on economics, but there are also other social arguments as well. So we need more immigrants. Immigration is likely to continue. And certainly we need the housing to accommodate those immigrants.
We're chatting tonight about housing. We're going to take a 2-minute break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes and talk a little bit more about housing. I'm going to talk a little bit about housing prices and debt levels. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Sorry about that Freudian slip there. I chatting tonight with Aled Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, and a very smart guy, as I mentioned before. He's got a master's degree in European and International Relations from the University of Amsterdam, where, by the way, he graduated with distinction. Then he's got a PhD in economics from Western University, and he's got a Said Business School. Said Business School, University of Oxford, with an Oxford Executive Leadership Program designation. He was a director at Environment Canada. He was a director at Finance Canada. He was a economic advisor at the Council of Canadian Academics, a special advisor at Finance Canada, and now he's the deputy chief economist at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I got to ask you, what was it like, going to University of Amsterdam and then school in Oxford?
Well, it's all been a very interesting experience. Amsterdam is a very interesting place. It was quite, I moved from Amsterdam then to London, Ontario, and so that was a bit of a difference.
That's a bit of a shock.
Yeah, but doing the PhD at Western, I mean, I didn't see much of London. It was the office 24/7 basically. So the Oxford was a bit virtual, so that's a whole different kettle of fish. But it was an interesting learning environment.
I got to ask you, your bachelor's degree in accounting, finance, and economics is at the name of a university I cannot pronounce. What is it, sir?
Aberystwyth.
And where is Aberystwyth?
It's a small town, a university town in the middle of Wales. It's on the coast. It's a relatively old university, but it's very Welsh.
And are you from Wales, sir?
I was born in Richmond Hill, and I grew up in Wales. So I have a funny accent. It's half Richmond Hill, half Wales.
Half Richmond Hill, half Wales. Sounds like a fascinating background. You were quoted on CTV just a little while ago talking about housing prices, and you didn't say that you thought housing prices would go down. A lot of economists actually disagree with you and think that housing prices need to go down. I saw a graph recently that showed that the debt to incomes, the debt to housing prices, the housing prices to rents, et cetera, almost every metric shows that we are higher than the United States was before their crash in 2009. Why do you think housing prices won't come down?
Well, you made a difference there whether they should come down or would come down. So there's a bit of a distinct. I think prices should come down if we get more supply, and to address that levels, house prices should come down. But I'm not sure that they will come down. So last year we took a look at the macro situation. We saw interest rates going up, and so we said, well, house prices will come down. Interest rates are now roughly where we were forecasting them, and so the price decline that stemmed from that interest rates we think is mostly baked in. We think we're not 100% convinced, but the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates as high as probably they're going to go, and so we've seen most of the decline in house prices. Maybe they'll go down a bit more, but our expectation at the moment is that they're bottoming out this year. Now, you probably noticed I had a few caveats in there. One caveat is that we're not sure how rapid or prolonged the decline in inflation will be. So it's coming down. Whether we'll come down to the bank's 1 to 3% target is that's a little bit uncertain, and that's one note of caution. So it may be that interest rates have to stay a little bit higher and a little bit longer, and that leads to a little bit of stress in the Canadian economy because of high debt levels. The other concern that we have is that, as you mentioned correctly, Canadian household debt is extremely high by international standards. And so this is quite a vulnerability for the Canadian economy. At the moment, Canadians can sort of handle the debt. Higher interest rates are, I think, going to cause a bit of problems. Not, overwhelming, but they're going to create problems. But then the question is, suppose that there was some new shock that hit the economy. I don't know, crisis in China or whatever, something that led to widespread job losses in Canada. And it's at that point we would be really concerned about debt levels. So this is not in our forecast at the moment. But we feel there's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of fragility in the Canadian economy, the Canadian housing system because of this high level of debt. So to go back to your opening question, prices should come down. There should be more housing supply to get house prices down so that people don't have to go into so much debt to buy these houses.
So if household debt is too high, and some people think and have told me that it's twice as high on average as household debt is in the United States, so substantially higher than it would be in other comparable economies. And housing prices aren't going to come down, and interest rates are going to stay a little bit higher, maybe not as high as they currently are. How can we be sustainable?
That's the concern, and so it's going to be a drag on the economy. Canadians are going to be putting more of their money into servicing mortgages than into saving for retirement, and all those savings going into productive investment and supporting business investment. So there's a bit of concern there, and at the moment, I see it as being a damper on economic growth. I mean, it's not overwhelming.
Let me, you're the smart economist. I'm just a business guy. But let me ask you and push you on this. I think that people were willing to have high debt levels because almost the way that Justin Trudeau, some people ridicule, talked about the deficit will solve itself. People thought that the debt would solve itself because the house price would increase, because it's always increased. It's been your best personal investment. It goes up over time. And so therefore don't worry about leveraging up, because the price is going to go up and that debt level will come down. But in a world where housing prices may not go down, but they don't go up anymore, or they don't go up nearly as rapidly, can we actually stomach that level of debt anymore?
Well, it depends what you mean, but when you say stomach it, probably we have to, well, those with it that have to stomach it. They don't have a choice. I think most data shows that foregoing their paying their mortgage debt is the last thing that Canadians will do. So they will have to face the burden of that debt, and it'll be a drag on everything else in their household spending. I mean, they won't have as much spending on, I don't know, entertainment, travel, savings. Just a bigger part of their budget will be taken up by that.
So you're saying that's actually good, because
Well, I'm
the
not
Bank
saying
of
it's
Canada
good.
wants us to bring down inflation. So we're all going to stop our spending on consumer things. So that'll bring down inflation.
Yes, and that's one of the arguments. I didn't say this is a good thing. That's one of the concerns that a lot of academic economists have at the moment, that the impact of higher interest rates in a world where everybody has so much debt. So it's an argument. It's one defense about why the Bank of Canada and the U.S. Federal Reserve were a bit slow to raise interest rates, because they were concerned about how households would be able to stomach this debt, because stomach the higher interest payments because of their high levels of debt. It's distorted. This debt is distorting a lot of decisions.
But the Bank of Canada got us in this position because they had interest rates so low that that high level of debt was cheap. And so a lot of us bulked up on it because it was so cheap.
That has been very cheap. The reasons for it are probably quite complicated. I mean, Dan Bernanke talked about excess savings around the world. So there's a lot of savings coming out of China. There's money sloshing around the system. Level of savings is too high. It has to go somewhere. It goes into housing, which is probably not the best thing. So I think we're missing policy tools here that would encourage more productive investment and a little bit less investment in the housing.
You're with Canadian Mortgage and Housing. Some people have said that there's length of term of mortgages in the United States that are more attractive than in Canada that are a problem. Other people have said that rules against non-recourse house loans in Canada are a problem. Other people have said they're good, because if you have non-recourse house loans, which you have in most states in the United States, if you're underwater, you just give them the keys and walk away. So how do you feel about some of those issues?
I think there's a lot of intricacies there. I have to admit the recourse. On the recourse issue, I would prefer the Canadian system. It seems to have been one reason why the Canadian banking system stayed relatively strong in 2008, 2009 during the crisis. I mean, things fell apart in some parts of the U.S. where the mortgage system was different, Arizona or in the South. So a lot of these things need to be thought about a little bit carefully. So, I mean, another aspect that I probably don't have enough knowledge of is the portability of mortgages. So, in the US at the moment, as you said, they're into 25-year mortgages. People are locked into 2% mortgage rates at the moment, but I believe that those mortgages are not portable for 25 years. I think that's what I read. And so if they're locked into interest rates at 2%, then and they're really not willing to move house because the mortgage would reset. So the 25-year structure in the US probably inhibits at the moment quite a bit of mobility around the US. And part of the strength of the US economy is having all US citizens or everybody in the US moving around the economy to where they can get the most for their skills.
But mobility is not a problem in the United States. As you mentioned, they're more mobile than Canadians on average. Home ownership is about the same. It's actually potentially a little bit higher, I thought, in Canada,
Yeah.
which has always surprised me, given that mortgage interest is deductible against your
Yeah.
taxes in the United States, and it's not in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's prudent that it not be deductible in Canada, but I guess what people are starting to wonder about is whether the mobility in the U.S. will start to decline because people are locked in with their mortgages. There is more recent research in the U.S. that shows that the rate of mobility within the U.S. has been declining.
So you would not be an arguer in favor of longer mortgage terms in Canada?
Not at the moment. No, I haven't studied this thing very closely, so I maybe have an incomplete picture. At the moment, I think the 5 year sort of or the resetting seems to work fairly well.
I don't mind the resetting, but I think a longer term is very advantageous, such that you can stomach, you can put up with a higher interest rate a little bit longer. It makes the debt something that you can appetize a little bit better. And so I do think that you should consider, as the deputy chief economist for CMHC, allowing us to amortize our debts over a longer period of time. Anyway, just for your consideration, sir. One of the things that we haven't talked about that I think we need to talk about is affordable social housing. And you also had a paper on social housing. Tell me what you think needs to happen there.
Well, one of the points of that paper is that when you look at the housing system, it's a combination of different sorts of housing and different sorts of problems. And one of the issues, I think, is that we need different policies for different parts of the housing system. So we've already talked a lot tonight about the need for more market housing, for more housing supply. So, better regulation and so forth. And this is very suitable towards the market-based housing. The situation with social housing is quite different. So more housing supply helps, but it's not clear that housing supply alone, it's almost sure that housing supply alone will not be helpful for social housing. I'll rephrase that for households with low income. Basically, some households have such low incomes that just you can't increase the housing supply enough. I mean, there is a construction cost for housing, there's a land cost, and so even if the land were given for free and there were a lot of subsidies, you still need some sort of support for people with very low income. So the point was to say we have as they say, a housing continuum, but the policy approaches will differ across that continuum. So this is not necessarily an appeal only for households to understand the plight of low-income households, but it's also an appeal for some housing advocates to understand the role of the market. So we need the housing market to work well. We need it to work efficiently. We needed to provide more housing supply, and that's done through the market, through business investment in rental, through the housing, through the business sector working efficiently. And that may not work for low-income households, but we need that to work. So there's a different approach, a different policy perspective on different parts of the market.
But I guess the
different parts of the system, I should say, because some parts are not going to be served by the market.
I agree with you. And so therefore, what is the potential solution, I guess, is a big challenge. I'm going to come back after a final set of messages and ask you about that, I think, because some people have been talking about the Manhattanization of Toronto. And are we at risk of creating a city where no one but the rich, or at least the upper middle income people, can live? Stay with us. We're going to come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about housing, affordable housing, social housing, housing prices, housing debt. etc. tonight with Aled Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I've loved this conversation. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Manhattanization of Toronto. Are we at risk of creating a city like Manhattan, where only the rich and maybe upper middle income people can live, and everyone else has got to live way out in Richmond Hill or farther, and not Wales, but Richmond Hill, and commute in?
I think this is a real possibility. Toronto and Vancouver, but both cities are the housing cost is becoming prohibitive. And my sense is that already some businesses are starting to think of moving. There are already anecdotes of businesses moving to Ottawa. There's some stories about businesses moving from Vancouver to Calgary. So, the housing costs are making it very difficult to attract workers. So it's going to be more for the rich than for everybody. I would say there is this risk or this tension, and you're already seeing it in some places like San Francisco, New York, Manhattan, as you mentioned. So yes.
I had one architect on my show just before Christmas who said that for some reason heights become this political hot potato, and that above 5 stories or so, people don't really notice how high a building is. And she said that the easiest way to solve social housing, affordable housing, etc., was to give people another 10 or 20 stories in exchange for inclusionary zoning, because the 10 and 20 stories would come real cheap, and you could give it to developers in exchange for something you want, and it would be almost costless, because it's not using up any more land, and it's using up space in the sky that really no one on the street will even notice. And it's just become a political thing that ward councillors and planning officials worry about when it's really not an issue. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I'm not the world's biggest fan of inclusionary zoning, but it's sort of a bit of a non-economic concept. I think there are arguments in favor of more social mixing. Whether that needs to be done within a structure or within a community, I'm not entirely clear about. This idea of, well, we need to restrict height to 10 or 12 stories, I don't see the logic of it. This concern about shadows, I think this is from a past era. So certainly I'd be advocating going as high as possible. As high as they can go, basically.
You heard it here. Go as high as you can go. Aled Iorwerth, Deputy Chief Economist, CMHC. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about housing. I think it is one of the big issues right now. Housing affordability has come top of mind to a lot of people. And I don't think we want to build cities that are only good for the upper middle income and the rich. I think we want to build cities that are dynamic and organic and at home for everybody. And that's what makes for a dynamic populace. So I agree. I think we need a lot of these things. And I think height could be one of the solutions. Density as well. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Richmond Hill or Wales at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thank you, sir.